Hello and welcome to episode 332 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leeks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm great, Andy. Tired because half of the Money to the Masses team is, well, actually not half. Most of you lot have been off over the last week or so at various different times. It seems to be me left holding the fort. So it's been some long days in the Money to the Masses towers, long, lonely days, in fact. But I may well be having some time off next week, so I have to caveat that. So there might not be a podcast next week. I'll chuck that in early for listeners. So if you don't see a podcast next week, then don't be surprised. I've managed to get a few days away and we'll be back the week after. But it's still great to see the impact all of you are having on our listeners, because this week there was a message in the Facebook group. So if you're not part of the Money to the Masses Facebook group, then do go and join facebook.com/groups/money to the masses. And Rachel put a note in there to say that she had saved £260 thanks to Lauren's piece on the podcast a couple of episodes ago about travel insurance and how she was able to get a refund because of the pandemic and she wasn't able to go on holiday. So Rachel tried the same trick and got a refund from her insurer, which was fantastic news. And not only that, I did also offer her a mug for sharing her experience. So that was deemed very mug-worthy. So if you have any other mug-worthy things or feedback, then do let us know, because you too could get a mug. But that made all of our day, I think. Lauren was buzzing, and of course it made my day too.
Now, that's a really good point, Damien. And on that, if anyone would like to review the podcast, we'd be ever grateful, because it's been a bit slow actually. I think people have been going on holiday. We'll forgive you, but please, if you can find the time to review the podcast in the relevant places, you know where to go, iTunes, etc. It really helps us out. It helps push that podcast up the charts, and we can share our expertise with more people. And we may even deem it mug worthy, and a mug could be winging its way to you. So that's kind of the admin out of the way. What have we got coming up on this week's podcast?
So the three pieces on this week, well, two of them have been inspired by listener questions that we've got in via our social media channels. So we do listen to you and we do like to answer your questions. So do us the favour of providing that feedback that Andy's asked for in terms of reviews. One of the questions is relating to investing money in the stock market now, whether to wait or do it all at once. So I'm going to touch on some very interesting research to help answer that question. The second part of the podcast, we're going to talk about 0% credit card debt, whether you should actually just repay it rather than leave it there and save money elsewhere, for example, in a savings account. And then lastly, we're going to bring Bronte onto the show, because she's going to do a whole piece on the best student bank accounts. There's lots of perks and incentives that will be interesting to people going to university. You may have children going to university, or you may know somebody about to go to university. So Bronte's done a piece on it this week. And also, she's the person who remembers what university is like, having just graduated about a month ago, as opposed to us old timers. So I thought it'd be appropriate to get Bronte back on the show.
Do you know what? I think I need to give Bronte a shout out as well. She didn't just graduate, she graduated with first class honours. So I think fair play to her.
Yeah, that was incredible and amazing. And we went out for lunch, actually, to celebrate her achievement, which was lovely. Her choice, it was Wagamama's, which is always a favourite. So that was well done to Bronte. So let's crack on with the first piece, which is about investing. And we had a question from Lewis, and it said, "Hi, I have an index fund that I invest in monthly over the long term that is performing at about 14%. They don't say whether that's 14% a year. That would be pretty punchy, so I'm not sure. But basically, it seems to be doing quite well. And the question carries on saying, I've just freed up some cash I want to add as a lump sum, but should I wait until it is performing slightly lower to reap maximum benefits from this? So this is an interesting question that I get asked quite often. And in essence, it's a bit about market timing. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is that obviously market timing is an impossible task to do with any kind of accuracy over the long term. And it's a bit of a fool's errand to try and perfectly time the market so you get the maximum benefit, i.e. avoiding any slumps and gaining the maximum benefit from any rallies. And before I did this podcast, I was looking back through our archives to try and find a podcast that was relating to pound cost averaging, because this is obviously relevant to the answer to this question. I couldn't find it, and I know I've done something in the past on it, but I found some bits of research that I carried out for 80/20 investor members. So what I want to do is just quickly recap over the idea about pound cost averaging, but also I'm going to slightly debunk pound cost averaging, which is something I'm going to come on to a bit later, which people will find interesting. So let me firstly just point out, back in 2016, I did a piece of work about market timing and how to invest a lump sum of cash, whether it's better to invest a lump sum in one go or whether it is better to drip the money into the market over a period of time. Now, the logical answer is that if you think the market is about to rally significantly, then you would be better off putting the money in as a lump sum straight away. And then if the market actually rallies in that way, then you will benefit because all of your money will benefit from that rally in equity markets, for example. Conversely, if markets tank and they fall significantly, if you put all your money in at the start, so let's say it's £10,000, then if the next day the market starts to collapse and fall 10, 20%, then that's going to impact your money. If it falls 20%, you're going to lose £2,000 almost overnight. Now, if that keeps going, a bit like after the dot-com bubble burst, then you can continue to lose money and your initial capital will be worth much less. If instead you dripped your money in over a period of time, and by dripping I mean that you decide a period of time over which you're going to place the money into the market in equal installments. It could be, for example, you decide you're going to put the £10,000 in £1,000 installments over 10 months. So 10 £1,000 monthly installments. The benefit of doing that, if you think of a market that's falling, every time you put money into the market, it's slightly lower than the previous time you put money in. What it means is that your money is buying more shares than the previous months. So by the end of the 10-month period, you will have acquired more shares than if you put all your £10,000 in at the beginning of the time frame before markets crashed, because you're basically picking up shares on the cheap. It's like a sale. Then when markets rebound, then you benefit from the rebound because you've got more shares, and some of those were bought at the market low as well. So as the market starts to rebound, you start to benefit. You can see that logically that should work. So the idea is that if you think markets are going to fall, then you can try and mitigate some of that by dripping your money into the market. If you think markets are going to just keep going higher, then you would be better off theoretically just pumping your money in as a lump sum at the beginning. But markets never quite behave as you want them to. Now, when I did the research, I'm not going to go into the numbers in any detail, but I looked at what happened if you dripped your money in over varying different time frames. And the longer the time frame that you drip your money in, so let's say you did it over a year, or maybe you extend it to 2, 3, 4, 5 years, then the lower the chance that dripping in would be better than investing a lump sum up front. So the differential starts to reduce. So that is something you're going to have to bear in mind. So if you drip in over 10 years, then the amount that you would outperform maybe a lump sum, even in a falling market, is going to be much smaller than it could have been if you dripped in over a short period of time when the market had collapsed. That is just the numbers if you look at it. And theoretically, you can kind of understand why that's the case, because less of your money is in the market for any given period of time, because you're sitting in cash for an extended period of time, or a good chunk of your money is not benefiting from compounding. So that is why it works out that way. So that is something to bear in mind if you're deciding on dripping in. You need to think about the time frame in which you do it. Now, obviously, it matters what happens in the market. When I looked at the numbers, if you'd have picked a period that went for the 5 years after the dot-com bubble that started crashing back in 1999, then dripping in, you would have made a 7% gain over those 5 years. But if you'd put all your money in at the start, basically of the crash, you'd have lost 20%. But that is almost cherry picking a period in time where there was like such extreme behavior. So that's the logical answer to the question. And my research looked at different time frames, and as I said, it showed that dynamic that the longer the period in which you drip in, then the benefit of doing so starts to reduce because markets tend to go up over the longer term. But what happens if you look at different markets? So let's say in the real world, what really happens rather than in a theoretical case. And that's what I want to talk about particularly today that I've not spoken about before, because Vanguard did a piece of research that I have not really seen get a lot of press. It was done, I think, back in 2012. And they looked at the performance of dripping in money into a market versus investing a lump sum up front over various different time frames, particularly 10-year rolling periods going back as far as 1926. But they also did it on various different markets. So in the UK, the US and Australia. They were the three key ones they looked at. But they also did it with different asset mixes. So whereas I was talking about looking at equity markets, I focused on the UK stock market in the analysis I did to demonstrate the point. They looked at different mixes of bonds and equities. So a bit like a portfolio. So for example, a 60% equity and 40% bond mix, which is something that's a bit of almost a default starting point for a lot of portfolio construction. And it's interesting that the person who asked the question talked about their index fund, because the all likelihood is they probably invest in an index fund, maybe, that has a mix like that. I mean, I don't know, I'm ignoring the returns that they're talking about, but life strategy funds, for example, at Vanguard have various different mixes of bond versus equity. And what was interesting is Vanguard looked at the performance of both strategies across those markets with those different asset mixes over different 10-year periods going back to 1926. And they found that the lump sum, i.e. investing your money straight away up front, outperformed over a 10-year period the drip feeding strategy 67% of the time. So taking the long-term average, that would suggest that most of the time you would be better off investing a lump sum up front. And when they looked at the returns over those 10-year periods, they found on average in the UK and the US, there was an additional 2.2% boost from investing a lump sum at the beginning rather than using a drip strategy. They too tried various different lengths of dripping the money in over that 10-year period. But the overall finding on average was that you would be better off using the lump sum strategy. In Australia, the additional performance was only 1.3%, a little bit lower, but still what was striking is that the results were almost uniform across all three markets. So that 67% chance was basically 67% chance in UK, US and Australia. So just to wrap up, why is that? And again, if you think about it, if you look at any stock market index or share price, typically over the long term. So if you grab your phone and you look at the FTSE 100, for example, or another index like the S&P 500 over the long term, you will notice that there are peaks and troughs, there are huge crashes along the way, but the markets do, over the long term, rise. And that therefore explains a lot of why we find this quite interesting result where a lump sum strategy tends to outperform a dripping strategy in the real world. But to conclude, this is a long-term average. So if you are still worried about the market, then theoretically the dripping strategy would still be the one you might opt for if you think the market's about to crash. But long-term averages suggest that the lump sum strategy still is the most likely one to outperform.
Okay, and so the next piece then was really inspired by a question that was asked through our Instagram account. And I'll read out the question, and Damien, you're going to cover it in just a second. So it says, "Hi guys, I've recently discovered your podcast. I'm already a fan. Thanks again for the feedback on that. I wondered if you could provide input or maybe cover in the podcast how to address credit card debt when it's at 0% interest. Would it still be considered a bad debt? Is it worth paying straight away, or is it a smart move to pay within the 0% interest term and save money elsewhere in the meantime? Thanks in advance." So this is kind of like a question of balancing up what to do, isn't it, in terms of debt? Is a 0% credit card a good debt, and how do you sort of manage it?
So the good debt, bad debt equation isn't necessarily to do with the rate you're getting charged on it. The concept of good debt and bad debt is based upon what the debt was used for. What was it? So let's say you used it to further your education, then that would be a positive debt because the long term it can have a positive impact on your financial situation. There's normally a plan to repay it and you normally got the cheapest deal. They're kind of three characteristics of good debt. So whether it's good or bad debt is kind of an historical thing, what they use the money for, and it kind of is irrelevant, to be honest with you. At the end of the day, they've got this debt that they're needing to repay at some point. So should you repay it ASAP? Now, the general rule of thumb with debt is if you have savings, then you'd want to pay back the debt with the savings, because it doesn't make sense to try and save when you're paying a really high interest rate on debt, because the average APR is about 17-18% and you're getting next to nothing on your savings account. But with a 0% debt, it's a bit of a different animal, because you're not technically getting charged on an ongoing basis for that debt. So should you pay it back, or should you put your money to use, or your spare money to use elsewhere? So I'm assuming that they've got extra money that they can do something with. Now, the first thing I would say is that you need to make sure you've got a plan to repay the debt back. So if you've got a 0% debt and you're just thinking, well, it's 0%, I don't have to worry about it, it will eventually sort itself out, then that's slightly a false economy, because at some point your 0% period is going to run out. And then you get into that merry-go-round where you're going to have to then keep shopping around trying to get on another 0% deal. And there's no guarantee you actually will do, because each time you go, you're going to be credit checked. So my message is that you need to, first of all, have a plan in place to ensure you repay that debt in the interest period that you've currently got. That would be an ideal in my view, rather than keep assuming you're going to be able to move it onto another 0% deal. Also, when you move it onto another deal, you are going to get charged a fee. That is, again, universal, and that can be 2 to 3%. So every time you do that, then you're going to get charged a fee up front on moving that debt across. Actually, I did say universally. There are one or two innovative products that are just coming out now that are spreading, or effectively spreading that upfront fee as a monthly payment over time. So you don't get charged up front for the transfer, you get charged a much smaller monthly fee across the time, but you're still paying money effectively. So the other thing I'm assuming when answering this is that you don't have any other higher interest bearing debt, because if you do, then 0% credit cards are a good tool, because what you want to do is the snowball effect, where you pay the minimum on your outstanding debts and then you direct any additional money to the highest interest bearing debt. And then when you've paid that one off, you take the money you've now got spare a month, including what you had been paying on that debt, and apply it to the next highest interest rate bearing debt. And you keep doing that until you get down to those 0% deals, and then you'll be able to clear all your debt by doing that. So that's a snowball effect. There are slightly different methods where you could just pick the debt that's the largest in terms of size, but I personally prefer the interest route that I just described. So that is a scenario where you wouldn't necessarily be paying off that 0% if you've got other debt. If you haven't got any other debt and you've got spare money and you're just thinking, well, should I pay it off now or should I start saving? And you've got a plan that you're going to clear that debt within that interest-free period before it ends, and it defaults onto its higher interest rate, then theoretically you could be better off applying your money to a savings account where you can get an interest rate, about 1% is the best you can get at the moment, or you could invest, because if you've got a plan to repay the debt anyway, then this spare money that you could use could start to invest and actually grow over time. The other thing, I would make sure you've got an emergency fund, actually, because you need to have that, because you need to break that cycle of debt. So if somebody's got a debt on a 0% credit card and that's all the debt they've got, then if they've never broken the cycle of accruing more debt, then the likelihood is they're going to get more debt on another card. So they need to build up some kind of buffer to be able to stop that link. We talked about it before. Some people suggest £1,000. So you need to stop using credit card debt to be able to then clear it, and you actually become debt free. And so, yes, there is an argument that you could divert your money to something that will grow it. If you've done all those things that I've mentioned and you are in a position where it's going to be repaid via a plan that you've come up with, it will inevitably mean you're paying more than the minimum on that 0% debt. But there is one argument for clearing a debt, and even a 0% debt, more quickly, because if you have a high usage of your credit limit, so let's say you had a credit card that you'd managed to get onto a 0% deal and it was a really sizable debt, but it was actually pretty much the maximum amount or a very significant amount of the available credit you have across your various different credit cards, then by clearing down that debt and reducing that percentage utilization of your available credit, that can actually improve your credit score when you go for credit in the future, when you're assessed. Because I've heard various different figures on this, but normally somewhere around about 15% or something like that is a good figure to aim for when it comes to credit utilization. So not maxing out your credit cards, having plenty of available credit, because it's seen by lender as you being able to manage your credit. You're not going up to your credit limits, you're able to manage it and repay it back. So there is a scenario and an argument that if you have a sizable 0% credit debt and it's a big portion of your utilization, that you would be better off actually actually clearing it. And of course, the other thing I want to mention is just the emotional pull, that if you've got debt, being clear of it so you don't owe anybody any money is emotionally positive. And for some people, that then won't have the feeling of getting rid of their debts and then moving into a world where they're actually not having to rely on credit cards as much. That can be very positive. And once they're in that world where they're not feeling like they're owing anybody any money, particularly on bad debts, that can be very positive and can influence their behaviour going forward and make them less likely to probably head backwards and start accruing bad debt again. So there's not one definitive answer to the question. There's a few things to consider, and it's a personal choice.
Okay, so moving on to the final piece of the podcast then, and we're going to welcome back a podcast favourite. We mentioned her earlier in the podcast. We congratulated her on an excellent first-class honours degree, and so I'm really sorry to embarrass you, Bronte. Welcome back to the show. We're going to be talking about student accounts.
Thank you for having me back. Yeah, so we're going to be talking about student bank accounts today, explaining what they are, what to look for in the best student accounts, and then we're also going to walk through some of the best ones on offer so far this year, ahead of kids going back to school in September. Lots of kids will be, young adults will be going into university. So timely, I think, right?
Yeah, it was depressing because I've realised it's more than 20 years since I went to university. It only feels like yesterday, but actually not. Let me rephrase that. It's more than 20 years since I left. It's not just go, it's since I left. So it's quite interesting to see some of the perks you talk about on some of these bank accounts, because one or two of the perks were things that I liked and used when I was a student 20 years ago.
Yeah, so before you open or you select a student account, you need to consider quite a few things. Not only is this where you're going to be storing, if you get a maintenance loan, all the money that you're going to be spending while you're at uni, where you're going to store the funds that you're then going to use to pay your rent, but you need to be looking at the overdraft facilities. And also, like you said, quite a lot of accounts come with their own individual unique features and perks, discount, those kind of things. So first of all, let's just start with what a student bank account is. So it's a bank account, kind of like a current account, but it's especially for students. Quite often you have to prove that you're a student in order to open one, such as with a UCAS confirmation letter to show that you've been accepted into a university, or proof of your A-level results, or if you're going to a college, you might need the acceptance letter to prove that you're going to college and you've been accepted for that course. So in terms of choosing the best student account for you, there's 3 areas that you really want to be paying attention to, and the most important one is your overdraft facility. So don't be tempted to just look at all the perks and the discounts and think, I'll pick that one because I'm getting a discount on ASOS or something. You need to be paying attention to the overdraft because, like it or not, most of us probably slip into our overdraft at some point as students. So most student accounts offer fee-free overdrafts, which means you don't have to pay interest on the money that you've taken out into your overdraft. So if you've slipped into your overdraft by £50, you can pay back that £50 without an additional charge on top. And that can be a really attractive feature. That's what distinguishes it from a lot of standard and regular adult current accounts, because those are the kind of accounts where you would be expected to pay a charge or interest. So as a student, that can be really useful.
Actually, just to cut in there, Bronte, some of the research you showed me, I didn't appreciate. It's been a long time, and I'm not sure it was like this when I was a student, because I remember fighting to try and get a student overdraft on an account. But they do overdraft facilities that increase over time, don't they? So you don't just get given necessarily a massive couple of £1,000 overdraft on day one of university. They're often staggered, aren't they?
Yeah. So quite often accounts will offer a certain amount in your first year. So a standard amount might be £1,000 or £1,500. And then through each year of your education, that would be increased. So year 2, you might get £2,000. Year 3, some accounts even offer up to a £3,000 fee-free overdraft. This differs depending on the account and the bank that you're with. And some of them have extra sort of conditions where I know that a couple of them will say that in your first term of your first year, so that's more or less the first sort of 2 months that you're at university, you will only be given a £500 overdraft. And then in your second term, it would be increased up to the full amount for that year. So there's certain terms and conditions that you need to pay attention to, essentially.
I like that. See, there's the student Damien would have not liked that kind of drip-fed overdraft, but the now sort of 40-something-year-old Damien loves that idea, because I know what it was like. And I remember when I was at university, people got their grants and loans, and they would max out and kit their room out in all the gear, and then suddenly realise they've got no money later on in university life, or particularly later on that academic year. So I quite like the idea that you are limited on your overdraft, because not everybody is great with managing money. I was terrible when I was at university. It wasn't because I was particularly different to anybody else. I just think that my priorities weren't necessarily managing money, because you get loans and overdrafts thrown at you. So let's jump onto the best accounts then. You highlighted some of the accounts and perks. I mean, it does slightly date this podcast, but a lot of these perks have been around for quite a number of years anyway. So let's run through some of the best accounts that are out there at the moment.
Okay, so the first one is Santander's 123 student current account. So this one's been around for a little while. It's very popular. So this one has a fee-free arranged overdraft cap of up to £1,500 in years 1 to 3 of your studies. So for most people, that would cover your entire degree, and you would have a £1,500 overdraft cap. So you cannot get any more than that. That's the limit. If you try and spend after you've reached that cap, it will just bounce and you won't be able to spend any more. But then if you are in a longer degree and you go into year 4, you would have £1,800. And if you've got a really long degree and you go into year 5, you would then get a £2,000 overdraft. So this one's one of the most generous ones on the market. But unlike some of the others, it doesn't do that drip fed thing that you're talking about, where there's that £500 cap in the first term. If you get the Santander account and you qualify for it, you're immediately going to get that £1,500 overdraft at the very start. So your first week of uni, you've immediately got £1,500 extra money sort of at your disposal, which is tempting, but you need to remember that that money, you need to repay it. It's not just there to be taken and then forgotten about. So that's something you need to consider.
These overdrafts, they are cheeky. They're like it's one of those money tips that I talk to young people about. They're basically a honey trap. And the reason why they give you such generous overdrafts is because banks know that typically that people will stay with the same bank for most of their life. There's been research that shows that people change their partners more frequently, like get divorced, than they do their bank. And they assume that given that you will be a graduate, that you'll probably get a high-paying job in time, which means you will buy a nice big house, which means you need a nice big mortgage, which they can earn nice big profits on. So that's the cycle. So it's just almost a short-term incentive for them, and therefore they catch you later on and they can make more money from you. So that's why they do it. On those accounts, though, Bronte, do they have any perks?
Yeah, so the Santander account, as one of the perks of just having one, has a free 4-year age 16 to 25 rail card. So that could get you to save up to a third on rail travel fares across the UK. So if you're a student who's commuting, maybe you are based somewhere else in the UK, but you're traveling into London for university or something, that could be really, really useful. And that's one of the really attractive perks of the Santander account. But you can also earn up to 15% cash back at a range of major retailers as well. So these are the sort of add-ons that make a lot of student accounts really attractive, that not only do they offer you really large and really generous overdrafts, but they quite often come with quite attractive perks that specifically attract students.
I have to say, Bronte, I miss my 16 to 25-year-old rail card. I hammered that thing because obviously my university wasn't anywhere near where I lived. I decided to go to the other end of the country almost, and so did my brother. And I saved so much money on that. So when I turned 25, it was with deep sorrow that I had to obviously hand back effectively my 16 to 25 rail card. Although there are other rail cards obviously out there that people can use. What about the other accounts out there?
So apart from the Santander student account, there's also one offered by HSBC. This one is a little bit more simple in terms of the overdraft. You get £1,000 in year 1, 2,000 in year 2, and 3,000 in year 3. And same as all these student accounts, it's a 0% interest rate on your overdraft. But this one comes with, instead of a rail card, you could get £80 in free cash just for signing up, as well as the choice between either a £20 Uber Eats voucher or a year of unlimited next day delivery with ASOS. So this is one of those ones where you can see the perks are really targeted towards young people. But bear in mind also that the overdraft in the HSBC account is less generous than the Santander one, for example, by £500 in the first year. So if you're prioritizing your overdraft, then the Santander one might be better for you. But we've also got, for example, Nationwide's Flex Student Current Account. This one has the same terms as the HSBC one, but this one offers you fee-free international banking. So, for example, if you're an international student or you frequently travel outside of the UK, this one's great because you won't have to pay any fees or any charges if you're using foreign currencies. Also, there's Barclays Student Editions account. So this one's one of those ones that has those drip-fed overdrafts. So this one has a £1,000 overdraft cap for year one, but it's capped at 500 in the first academic term. But then it's £2,000 in year two, £3,000 in year three, and any subsequent years of study, it's also capped at £3,000. This one comes with a free Perligo subscription. So Perligo is a sort of online database that's full of non-fiction and fiction books, journal articles, those kind of things. So the particularly keen scholars, the kind of young budding intellectuals might find this one really useful because Perligo is actually quite expensive, but you get it for free as part of that account.
I'm so glad that you mentioned what Perligo was, because before we did this podcast, I actually had to ask Bronte. So I'm not in the young intellectual crowd, clearly.
And so then finally we have the Lloyds Bank and the NatWest Student Bank account. So the NatWest one, similarly to the Barclays Student Bank account, also drip feeds you that £500 cap in the first academic term. So if you're worried about relying too much on your overdraft, like Barclays, that could be a really good option for you. And the Lloyds Bank Student Current account, quite like the Santander one, also has a £1,500 overdraft in the first year. But the Lloyds one has not only up to 15% cash back at loads of different high street retailers, but it also has a save the change roundup function and a free totem card, which, similar to other schemes like Uni Days, basically gives you loads of discounts in loads of shops and stores and cinemas and so on. And the NatWest account also gives you a free £50 in cash for signing up, as well as a free taste card, which gives you discounts and 2-for-1 deals at cinemas and restaurants and so on. So if you're the kind of person who, like many students do, like to go out, eat out a lot, go to the cinema, then that's also a great option for you.
So I'm blown away by the amount of content you put in there, Bronte. You got a first-class honours degree in student bank accounts. But for anyone listening, there's a lot of information to take on board, and we have got all of this in an article presented in an easy format so you can go through it really quickly and compare the different accounts. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Before we finish though, Bronte, if you had to pick one, which would you have?
I had the Santander one and I thought it was great. I thought that the overdraft facilities were really generous and honestly were really useful because, like many students, I did end up in my overdraft more than I'd like to admit to. I was also a frequent traveller and travelled around the UK a lot, so the rail card definitely came in handy.
Okay, just to finish that piece off then, what happens when you graduate after you've had one of these student accounts?
So most of these providers actually offer an automatic sort of switch onto their own graduate account. Typically, these give you longer interest-free periods to pay off any overdraft you've accrued during your undergraduate studies, and they also have very generous overdraft limits, often even more generous than the student bank accounts as well. So it just might be good if you're graduating from being an undergraduate and you're just moving into the working world. Graduate accounts are great.
So they're basically keeping you sweet and primed so they can make more profit from you in the future. So thanks for that, Bronte. That was fantastic as ever. That is it for this week, Andy. I think we're done.
That is it. We're done indeed. So if you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com. Twitter, it's at moneytothemasses with the number 2. And you can also get in touch and interact with us via our Facebook group. It's facebook.com/groups/moneytothemasses. And as we mentioned at the start of the show, it would be great if you could get on there and review the podcast. We will likely deem it mug worthy. And so a Money to the Masses mug could be winging its way for you. So that's it. We're done, Damien. Until next time.
Until next time.